Welcome back to the channel, and today it is time to look at another stalwart in the cheap vintage class arena. The SMC Pentax-M 50mm f2 was manufactured by the Asahi Optical Company in Taiwan from 1979 to 1985. Now, you might have encountered these lenses as the cheapest kit option with the Pentax K1000, Pentax ME Super, or even the Pentax MX from the same period. In the SMC Pentax M series of 50mm primes, you'll actually find a 1.4, f1.7 and also an f2. Now, interestingly, in 1975, for a very short period of time, there was even an f1.2 available. But generally, people won't consider that part of the traditional M series Canon. The M series, which is a range of completely manual lenses, was later replaced with the SMC Pentax A series of lenses. And that was, for all practical purposes, really identical, except that with the A lenses, it afforded some automation. The A lens could be controlled from the camera body. For instance, in the case of aperture priority, then you would set the aperture priority on the camera. The M lens, if used with the aperture priority setting, would shoot wide open regardless of the f-stop that you have set the aperture to on the lens. The A lenses also allowed for matrix pattern light metering, whereas the M lenses used stop-down metering. I've used the 50mm f2 extensively with one of my Pentax K1000s. In fact, this one is my Hong Kong version when shooting film. But I also tested it out on my Canon R6 mirrorless camera for video. In fact, while doing a video of the K1000 recently, I'll link it in the description. But before we go ahead and discuss my experience and images with this lens, let's have a look at some of the technical specs. The focal length, it's a 50mm. The lens mount is the Pentax K bayonet mount, also referred to loosely as the PK mount. Aperture, f2 all the way to f22. Diaphragm, it's an automatic 6-blade diaphragm. The lens optics, it gives you a simple 5 elements in 5 groups. It has the SMC or super multi-coating. It is a manual focus lens. The focus throws around 200 degrees, more or less. Minimum focusing distance is 45 centimeter. The maximum magnification is 0.15 times. The filter thread size is 49 millimeters. Diameter is 63 millimeters. Length 31 millimeters. The weight, the early metal barrel version is 165 grams, and the later versions with a plastic barrel is only 138 grams. Now, the construction of these are the early models, metal barrel, glass, and then some plastic, and the later models is plastic barrel, some metal, and glass. Now, the difference between the metal barrel and plastic barrel can be observed when looking next to this white dot there. The metal one will have a ridge there, whereas the plastic one, like mine, is flat, suggesting that this is one of the later models. Price that I've seen, anything from $30 to $60. Let's have a look at some of the images and a short video I made before we dive into my experience of the lens. Now let's look at some of my own observations on this lens, and the usual disclaimer needs to be made. This is not a laboratory lens analysis or comparison. This is my subjective take and experience with my own copy of the lens, which after 40 years cannot be considered factory mint, really. It is in very good condition, but it's 40 years old. I really like the small form factor of the lens, and it feels pretty good when handling. It's very solid. The throw is firm and smooth. It's actually really nice, and it's easy enough to hit sharp focus with this lens. The lens is really light, so the weight in your hand is almost negligible. It's really beneficial when you're building up a video rig. Having used the lens extensively for 35mm film photography and then also on my Canon R6, two things become clear. On film, the lens presents as really sharp, especially wide open, but in much larger digital files, one notices some spherical aberration, which is understandable for a bottom-of-the-line kit lens. It'll present in a bit of a, not technically a blooming effect, but like a soft halo around the sharp bits, which in some film occurs naturally, and so it's not really obvious always on film. And film's a little bit more rough, where these lenses were designed years before digital photography was even a possibility, and thus the performance was optimized for medium grain 35mm film. Therefore, in my own experience, the black and white film images I shot with this lens just reads more crispy and sharp, even when you do very high-res scans, and much sharper than it feels on the frames that you get from a digital camera. I do perceive like a pleasing depth in the images I don't always find with other lenses. The effects of the spherical aberration subsides and the lens becomes really sharp from almost 5.6, but all the way to f22, but f8 onwards, great. When shooting straight into light, there's a bit of veiling flare and that gradient flare blooming that you find. The chromatic aberrations on the lens are actually minimal. The bokeh is smooth, but it's dependent on the nature of the background. Vignetting is prominent at f2, but it cleans up when you get to f22. Barrel distortion is minimal, if not negligible. All things considered, for the price, I have to recommend the lens. It's not as iconic or quirky as the 55mm f1.8 Takuma, the M42, or as popular really as that range of M42 Takuma lenses. But the lens renders solid, good color and contrast, good vintage lens contrast and sharpness, if I can call it that. Even though the aesthetic of the lens is not modern, it doesn't feel like a modern lens, it does not read as an old lens either, but renders to my eyes at least a really pleasing filmic look with real nice depth. So for very little money and the fairly low cost of a mount adapter to use this lens on your mirrorless camera, this is a beast of a little lens that can be augmented by other focal lengths from the M series to build out a very useful and cheap vintage cinema lens kit. When looking at these lenses, always remember to compare it with something of the same spec and price range. If you have any experience with this lens, please share it in the comments below. Also, like and subscribe, that usual thing. And I will post some links to some deals I found on this lens. And yeah, I'll see you in the next video.